So here in our next step in this extended lecture series, we're going to talk about constraint geology as in being in time, or nature in time, as the field of becoming, the informational field of becoming. We talked about the latticing, and Schrödinger talks about this quite presciently before the founding of DNA. He understands that there is a crystallization of thermonuclear energy in time, which is being scaled evolutionarily, which is the genome. And so when you see genomic architecture in life, I want to share these two examples, and then we're going to cut a little deeper into this phenomenon. I'm driving, and there's a seed falling from a tree, and I just reflexively, I think in large part due to these continued exchanges, gently picked it up off my lap and released it back into the grass and the air. So clearly, right, we're talking about constraint geology down to the level of the seed pod from the tree that floats in and is seeking ground. And this is happening across scales in Earth nature. And then I also want to bring up, I just received a Shelley pamphlet, 1852, a James Watson imprint during the Chartist movement in England, which was spurred on substantially by Percy Shelley and his articulations, The Mask of Anarchy, which was Shelley's, you could say it's his most surface document. It's the document in which his poetry is most distilled, most simplistic, and most legible to the English-British population at large and the working class population at large. And it's a distillation of his unfolding cosmology. And the reason why I want to bring that up is it is the insertion. We're talking about informational technology. So when we're talking about the genome and we're talking about constraint modification and constraint geology, informational technology which is scaling through time in this perennial process of reproduction, which is the breaking open of the seed pod, so to speak, across generations, which is the persistence module or mechanism for any given species of being in time. So we have the insertion, Shelley's pamphlet insertion of a constraint modifier, translated for the neural ceilings of the population or populace at large. So this is a latticing of information. This is an infrastructural movement of information through poetic disclosure, scaled specifically for contemplation by breakpoints and constraint. So you have very sophisticated metaphysics that Shelley is communicating in his magnum opus, Prometheus Unbound, which requires a certain degree of specialization, which is to say, history, mythology, and an understanding of metaphysics, very highfalutin, abstract poetic language, which is why Shelley is so often misread as an obscure poet, because he's not a poet, he's an ontological metaphysician. So he is inserting with The Mask of Anarchy, and this is why it becomes a rallying cry for the working class around the world throughout history. He is inserting a distillation, a translation of his metaphysics, his we could say his superstructural realization of constraint and liberation across all scales into the actual existential condition of being human, which is to say that perception itself is made possible by the evolutionary unfolding of the genome, and that the genome itself is a constrained mechanism. It's a neurological phenomenon which is needing to persist regulatorily against time and in time. So there are these two phenomena here, and I'm going to connect them in terms of constraint geology, which is the new phase of this work, that civilization, the human organism, we're moving towards a cosmological totality wherein there are no longer isolated historical entities or even historical moments or junctures of being in time, but rather this system, you could call it the Earth system itself, becomes intelligible as temporary local phases within the cosmological transmutation of thermonuclear energy across deep time. So this is a total distillation of all of the genetic and genomic attempts of scaling neural architecture in all of Earth's history into a present moment transformation and a phase-changing state of the attempt to disclose that the human being itself is no longer simply a biological organism or existential subject, that the human being becomes a recursive disclosure architecture formed from thermonuclear history itself. And this is why I'm talking about constraint geology, is that the body is a condensed cosmological process itself. And so constraint geology is constraint cosmology in terms of landedness of being, that being itself obtains form in a regulational sense. The nervous system is stellar and geological time crystallized into perceptual structure, being translated through the genome as an iterative process over time. So consciousness itself becomes the local phenomenological aperture through which the cosmological process recursively encounters itself. And again, this is disclosure of being to beings. And the long time scale process, the project of the ontos, perhaps founded most decisively in Heraclitus and his cosmological fire, and the Heraclitean fragments which persist to this day, this long time scale process of the revelation of the ontos by Renaissance minds. So earlier we've established that the persistence architecture of being under entropy is at all scales in operation. Stars, cells, organisms, civilizations, symbols, and images, they're all participating in one continuous scalar process of persistence against dissolution. So this now is not only how being persists, but how being becomes disclosed to itself through increasingly sophisticated informational architectures produced through deep time energetic transformation. This is thermonuclearity. And I insist upon this term because it allows us to connect the process of stellar formulation, which is solar system and galactic systems, all the way down to the human being metabolic, reproductive, respiratory process of being in time, this regulatory neurological system, which needs to persist through regulation of energy, and how it inscribes symbols into configurational architecture, primarily in deep ancestral time that persists to this day, stone. And again, the hieroglyph becomes one of the most condensed forms of this linguistic process, and this connects deeply back to poetry as the innocent language. So this is a scale change. Now, where we're now talking about the genome not simply as a biological inheritance, which is couched within a sort of human condition of genetic ancestry, but as a crystallized informational memory accumulated across billions of years of energetic filtration under constraint. That the genomic architecture is a thermodynamic archive of being across species. Through sexual recombination, evolutionary persistence, thermonuclear energy gradually condensing into increasingly sophisticated informational structures, capable of preserving and transmitting adaptive relations to existence across time. In allowing for emerging through this process, not merely life, as in, again, we've discussed the survival architecture of human history, but disclosure capacity, which is the origination and establishment and founding of the Renaissance mind of being in time, which allows for this recursive realization, which is self-realization across all scales, the metaphysical architecture, which is the operator identity, which we've discussed fundamentally in prior. So again, this is this critical threshold of the genome producing the nervous system producing the possibility of perception, perception producing symbolic relation, and symbolic relation producing civilization, civilization externalizing and preserving informational continuity beyond the mortality of the individual organism. So civilization itself is an extension of genomic informational architecture into symbolic and historical form. And so this is the seed pod that I just discussed, this experience interrelated so deeply and profoundly with Shelley, and this insertion of the pamphlet into civilizational history, which is the human archive of information through language, the innocence of poetic ontological inquiry or insurrection into being, which allows for historical change, increasing structural historical change, even as this deep time cosmological drive towards disclosure capacity must continue through genomic evolution. So the entire history of civilization can therefore be reinterpreted as the externalization of disclosure architecture, and this is the Renaissance mind as the vanguard of this process, both genetically and architecturally in terms of the symbolic linguistic capacity for disclosure, which is the communication of the condition of the Renaissance mind. So writing, art, religion, science, architecture, photography, computation, artificial intelligence are not separate domains of activity. They are recursive informational technologies emerging from the deep time cosmological drive towards increasing disclosure capacity. This is originating from the crystallization and lattice structure of the genome as a thermonuclear evolutionary cosmological process, which is expansion of neurological capacity. The founding of the nervous system is a paradigm shift in the possibility of disclosure capacity, which is being coming in relation to being. They are persistence architectures, which you could say are secondary, as in their symbolic architectures, through which being attempts to preserve and deepen relationship to itself beyond the local limits of the biological substrate. So these two things are occurring in intimate relation. This is why the geological dimension is so fundamental in this new phase here, because it's not a metaphor. It's structurally homologous with consciousness itself. So mountains, genomes, civilizations, and symbolic systems are all evolving through accumulation, pressure, compression, sedimentation, rupture, erosion, and catastrophic transformation. Consciousness itself is geological intemporal structure, that the genome is iterating nervous systems that are themselves linguistic bodies of this absolute transformative process at the cosmological level. So civilization is sedimented cognition. It is the preservation, libraries, cities, archives, religions, institutions, and digital systems. Stratified informational deposits within the larger geology of disclosure, which is being itself in time. History itself becomes a geology of consciousness. So the human organism, therefore, is a temporary thermodynamic crystallization through which cosmological energy becomes recursively perceptible. And this is the process of genomic articulation and iteration across time. So the body itself is not separate from cosmology. It is cosmology folded inward through neural architecture. Again, this emphasis on the term thermonuclear. The nervous system becomes a local aperture of deep time informational recursion. Disclosure. Being disclosing. This is why the Renaissance mind is so important, because it is not exceptional intelligence, none of these polymathy. It is the high-resolution disclosure architecture that emerges from deep time persistence conditions. It crests over being. Certain genomic, neurological, symbolic, historical recombinations, however you want to formulate this frame, and this could go very deep into the continually unfolding neuroscientific examination of how intelligence forms and how cognition forms, the evolution of the brain itself. We observe this process as magnitude is phenomenologically present to humanity. These recombinations, genomic and neurological, and the capacity for symbolic disclosure, produce unusual permeability to being. These organisms themselves possess greater continuity across domains, greater symbolic integration, greater temporal depth, and greater ontological openness to disclosure. So this traditional genius, so to speak, whatever the term is therefore reinterpreted as intensified disclosure capacity. This is heightened participation within embodiment, greater continuity between perception and reality. Again, disclosure capacity. Greater permeability to the structural operations of being itself, which is the ontos, the existential identity of being itself as a total cosmological tradition across all scales, and a total cosmological condition. So this also transforms our understanding therein, right, in a historical lens, zooming in on the historical lens, our understanding of fragmentation and technological modernity. It is the inevitable consequence of limited neurological architectures and neural architectures, which are glacially evolving, glacially producing Renaissance minds, attempting to process exponentially accelerated informational recursion. The Renaissance mind is itself the capacity and possibility of uniting ontologically these deepening specialized fields as technology exponentially evolves. The technological condition is of moving in relation to human nervous system evolution, which is evolving under conditions of local survival cognition, tribal scales, slow informational transmission, immediate energetic pressures, and limited symbolic density. But as civilization increasingly externalizes cognition and hyper-accelerates into technological systems, operating far beyond the inherited and integrative capacities of the organism, this is productive of a ceiling crisis, this capacity crisis of the neural condition of the species itself. This is technological modernity, an unprecedented evolutionary tension between inherited biological disclosure architectures and exponentially expanding external information recursion. Contemporary civilization experiences fragmentation, alienation, ideological collapse, overstimulation, hyperspecialization, symbolic exhaustion, and existential disorientation. So the species' nervous system is struggling to metabolize the informational architectures it has produced. But this is a productive tension because civilization is not merely preserving existing consciousness, it is recursively reshaping the conditions under which consciousness evolves. So this is a mutual process where human beings are not only producing civilization by way of their neural thresholds, but civilization is producing new forms of perceptual organization in return. This is technology. Symbolic systems become evolutionary environments acting upon consciousness itself. And again, this returns us to Shelley's pamphlet and the importance of the 1852 reproduction of The Mask of Anarchy in the Chartist movement as a pirate publication by Watson. Civilization itself, in its highest form, and this is again why we remember the Renaissance mind historically across large timescales, is that it is a disclosure architecture, temporary local phase in the cosmological evolution of the informational being. So thermonuclear energy becomes chemistry. Chemistry becomes geology. Geology becomes biology. Biology becomes genome. Genome becomes nervous system. Nervous system becomes symbolic regulation, or symbolic relation rather, and symbolic relation becomes civilization. Civilization becomes recursive external cognition. And through this entire chain, disclosure capacity increases. Because it is this process is actually developing the ability to become perceptible to itself in a cosmological sense through increasingly sophisticated informational architectures. Not through linear teleology or providential design, but through recursive persistence under constraint across deep time. So constraint itself becomes the generative condition of disclosure. This is a process. So, a couple more notes here. Without bounded structure, there is no perception. Without genomic architecture, there is no nervous system. Without nervous systems, there is no symbolic continuity. Without mortality, there is no historical memory. Without limitation, there is no intelligibility. The prison itself is the prism, to use the term we've discussed in prior lectures. Constraint produces the conditions through which being becomes phenomenologically available. Thus, the human organism becomes neither merely machine nor spirit, but a temporary recursive architecture through which thermonuclear history becomes capable of perceiving itself. Civilization becomes the externalized memory and symbolic extension of this recursive process. Consciousness itself becomes the cosmological evolution of disclosure through informational persistence architectures unfolding across geological and historical time. This is a deep time evolutionary phenomenology of disclosure, the study of how cosmological energy progressively crystallizes into informational architectures, capable of increasingly sophisticated relationship to being itself. Thank you.